Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the FIDE World Cup semifinals, round number 7, being held in Baku, Azerbaijan. Now, yesterday, Magnus won a scintillating game with the white piece against GMHikaru Abasov from Azerbaijan. Today, game number 2, with GMHikaru having the white pieces and Magnus having the black pieces. Magnus in a situation where if he can draw or win, he advances to the grand finals, where he will play either Fabiano Caruana or Ramesh Babu Pragnanantha. All right, let's jump right into the action. So Magnus has the black pieces, Abasov trying to create a game. So the game starts with d4, we get knight to f6, knight to f3, d5, and now Abasov plays bishop to f4, essaying the classic London system, which he played to great success in his previous match against Vidit Santos Gujarati from India, winning a great game in the second classical game to win that match and qualify for the Canada's tournament in 2024. So if it's working, why not play it? Now, obviously, Magnus is a player who's played the London system himself with the white pieces, so it's not a huge surprise. Magnus decides to play bishop to f5, and now we get e3 and e6. Now, systems with bishop f5 mirroring bishop f4 are considered to be amongst the most solid. In fact, I myself played this quite a few times in the Champions Chess Tour in the past against players like Levon Aronian, and the famous draw meister himself, Anish Giri, has also played this exact same setup with bishop f5 and e6 as well. So Magnus is joining some great company. So after e6, we get knight b to d2. Now we get knight b to d7. Abasov plays c4, and Magnus plays this move d takes c4. Now, up to this point, we have a mirror where both sides have mirrored their moves. It's an identical position, but after c4, black maybe can play c5, but I think it's a little bit dubious, because after pawn takes pawn, if you take with the pawn, now white can take, and black ends up with this isolated pawn on d5, potentially down the road. And if you play the move knight takes pawn, after bishop to g3, white is threatening to go e4, forking the knight and the bishop. If you take on d4, you lose the game because of e4. And if you move your bishop back to, say, g6, white can now go bishop b5. And there are all kinds of problems on this diagonal. White still has e4 to kick the horse out of town as well, and black is in some trouble. So Magnus instead decides to take. Abasov takes with the bishop. He does not take with the knight here, because if you take with the knight, black can play bishop b4 check, and now you either have to retreat with the knight from c4 or with the knight from f3. So Abasov takes with the pawn with the bishop. Magnus goes bishop d6, trying to trade off this great dark square bishop that white has. And in return, if the bishops are traded, you could argue that black's bishop on f5 is slightly better than the bishop on c4, because there are ideas like rook c8, and black may have some chances to obtain the advantage. So Abasov plays knight to e5 here. Magnus plays knight to e4. He does not trade the knights, because after pawn takes knight, your bishop and your knight get forked once again, and you will lose the game. So we get knight to e4 here from Magnus. Abasov plays f3. Magnus trades, and now he plays this move f6. And Magnus is trying to play very solid here, exchange pieces, get it more towards an endgame. With limited material, it's going to be much tougher for white to prove the advantage, even though white does have a slight advantage here, because at this point, there are only bishops, queens, and rooks on the board. Pawn structure very dry too. Neither side really has much in the way of pawn pushes. White can maybe claim a slight advantage due to potentially having the big white center with e4 and d4, but overall it's not very much. And in a game where you have to win to stay in the match, it's very hard to believe that a player like Abasov, or frankly anyone for that matter, will be able to prove this very minor advantage in the way that Stockfish would. So Abasov goes to e4, and now Magnus makes an interesting decision here by playing the move bishop g6. When I was doing my live commentary on Kick, I was expecting Magnus to trade the bishops and then play bishop g6 here, and thus eliminating the possibility of white keeping the dark square bishops on the board. Whereas in the game, after Magnus goes bishop g6, now Abasov had the option to play bishop e3, keeping both sets of bishops on the board here and having this big white center as well. Now, I was fairly shocked when I saw rook d1, because in a situation where you have to win here to stay in the match, you want to keep as many pieces on the board as possible. So I was very surprised to see rook d1, because I felt the bishop e3 from a fundamental standpoint had to be the right try if you're trying to win the game. Instead, we get rook to d1. Magnus trades the bishops now, does not miss his opportunity, and he goes bishop f7 here, trying to guard the pawn on e6. Now, bishop f7 is played for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's very hard to activate the bishop on this long diagonal here. If you ever go f5, white can at the very least play e5 here, and where is this bishop going? Simply nowhere. So if you can't play f5 to open up this diagonal, the bishop simply is useless on this diagonal. So it makes more sense to go back to f7, because if white ever plays e5, potentially you can drop back to g6, and now the bishop has some scope on this long diagonal once again. And if white doesn't play e5 down the road, there might be a chance to play e5, creating a fossil where you attack both the queen on f4 and you attack the bishop on c4 at the same time. So after bishop f7, Abasov plays this very unusual move, king to f2, which I really did not like at the time. At this point, I felt that Abasov had to make a decision, which is either you're happy to make the draw and be very solid, or you go all in with this move e5. Now, as I said, e5 does have some drawbacks potentially. First of all, if black could get bishop g6, he would be fine. But in this case, bishop g6 is not an option, because after pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and queen takes pawn, white is up one pawn already, and you're going to lose this pawn on e6, or you're going to lose your rook in the corner pocket. Either way, white should be winning. So after e5, black probably should play this move f5, and on first glance it's very tricky, because when we look at positions like this from either color, we're looking at concepts. We're not looking at it move by move, because in this position there are no flash tactics. There's nothing that's instantly winning or losing, and it's about the plans that you have in this middle game. Now, the reason that e5 is very committal, and probably Abasov did not play it, is he probably thought that after e5 f5, let's say you castle, black castles here, he probably saw a position like this with rook d2, queen c6, bishop b3, rook d7, rook d1, rook d8, and he probably figured that here after queen to b6, even though the bishop is locked in behind the pawns on e6 and f5, this pawn on d4 is a big weakness. Black has two rooks and a queen, threatening to capture the pawn down the road. Black also has other ideas like h6 and g5 potentially, and Abasov probably figured, well, even though the bishop on f7 is bad, the bishop guards the pawns, and your d4 pawn is weaker than the pawns on e6 and f5. Now, the reason this actually would have been very good is that after f5, castles here, white can remove the queen to e3 here, and black is actually not in time to get the setup with queen b6 and the double stack of the rooks. If black plays queen c6, you can now go rook to c1, queen to b6, rook f d1, rook d7, and now you have this move bishop to b3. And the reason that this is so strong is that after black plays rook h d8, you can now go rook c5, cutting off the threats towards the pawn on d4. If black tries to take the pawn, this actually loses the game, because after rook takes rook, queen takes rook, there's rook takes rook check, creating the fossil, and after king takes rook, queen takes queen, typical Botez gambit, GG, why not? So in this position, after rook to c5, black cannot really put pressure on this pawn on d4, and let's say black plays a move like c6, after queen c3 here, guarding the rook and the pawn at the same time, king to b8, white can now move the bishop back to c2, and after a move like g5, white goes b4 here, reinforcing the rook on c5, but more importantly intending to push p on the queen side with a4 a5 or a4 b5, trying to open up the b file down the road. And this is actually already highly unpleasant for black to play. Now, it's not winning or anything with perfect play, but nonetheless, black would have been under a lot of pressure here. Now, again, can't be too critical of Abasov, because in order to get to this position, he would have had to have seen this idea with rook c5 really early, probably as early as this position. In fact, seeing these ideas, same thing applies, by the way, if black castles kingside. You have the same idea with queen e3, queen c6, bishop b3, rook d8, rook c1, and again, you get the exact same setup with rook c5. You get rook to d1, queen c3, bishop c2, and b4, and white is better. But if you don't see the idea with rook c1 and rook c5, and even more than that, seeing like seeing this idea with queen c3, bishop c2, and b4, it's almost impossible to go for this, and Abasov does not see it, or he doesn't like it, and instead he plays this move king f2. Now, I really don't like king f2 for a couple of reasons here. First of all, you probably should castle the king out of the center of the board, but when you go king f2, one of the reasons you do not castle the king is that you're expecting queens or rooks to be traded, and in an endgame, you keep the king closer to the center. Now, in this case, that is simply not going to happen, as we will see, because Magnus plays queen c6, we get bishop b3, and now he goes queen b6, we get queen to e3, castles, and already it's too late for white to get this e5 idea in any longer, because Magnus got the queen to b6. He gained a tempo here when he attacked the bishop, gained time. White does not have the time to set up the rooks. Instead, you have to waste time with bishop b3, and now it's already too late. So Abasov plays rook d2, we get rook d7, rook d1, rook to d8, and now Abasov plays bishop c4, which is a fairly serious mistake in this position. At this point, however, it's almost equal already, because black has gotten the optimal setup with the two rooks and the queen. You no longer have time to get that setup that I mentioned before with rook to c5, queen c3, bishop c2, and b4, because if you play rook c2 in this position, you simply hang the pawn on d4. So you can't move the rooks off the d file. The rooks are glued guarding the pawn. You can't really move the queen either. If you play queen c3, now black can potentially play e5 due to the pin along this diagonal from the b6 queen towards the king on f2. So already it's very tricky for white to play, and I think at this point Abasov realized that he had messed up the position a little bit, but he gets very careless and plays this move bishop c4. Now bishop c4 on first glance doesn't look like that serious of a mistake, because you're just going to go bishop c4 and then play b3. If you were to play a3, for example, now the bishop is potentially under attack at some point, like f5, e5, f4, and suddenly you have some weaknesses. So bishop c4 looks fine, but now black can play c5, and suddenly the position changes completely, and if anybody is in danger, it's actually white here. And the reason for that is that now black is threatening to capture the pawn on d4 with this pawn, and you cannot take the pawn on c5, because after rook takes rook, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, queen takes rook, queen takes pawn, it's check. But more importantly than it being checked, when you block or move the king, either way doesn't matter, you lose the bishop on c4 and you lose the game and you resign, very politely or very angrily. So if you can't take the pawn on c5, then the only move that you can play to not lose material is d5. Any other move, let's say rook d3, you simply hang the pawn on d4 and you're going to lose the game. So after c5, you have to play d5, but now after pawn takes pawn, Abasov plays pawn takes, Magnus goes king to b8 here, just sidestepping any threats on the c file. We get a3, and after queen d6, the dust has settled, and now Magnus, in typical vintage fashion, has an advantage for the following reason. White's king a little bit weak here on f2, the pawn on h2 a little bit weak, but more than that, there's a slight imbalance where white has a pass pawn on d5, but it's completely blockaded here, and black can start to try and use either the open e file or down the road potentially the open c file as well. So after queen d6, we get g3 from Abasov. Magnus plays rook to e7, we get queen c3, and now h5 here. Already we're starting to see the problems where this pawn is a permanent weakness. You're really distracted trying to guard it, but Magnus can claim the open e file. He can play h4, try to use the open h file as well, and it's getting very, very scary. And additionally, your bishop on c4 completely useless, no queenside attack really, and it feels like the game's starting to go in the wrong direction. So after h5, Abasov plays b4 pretty quickly, and as I mentioned during my live commentary, it felt like at this point Abasov realized he'd messed it up, and he just felt like, I'm going to play quickly, play moves that make sense, treat it more like a blitz game, and if worse comes to worse, I'll lose, but so be it. I just don't want to spend a lot of time. So we get b4, Magnus plays h4 here, trying to open up the king side. We get pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen to d4, Magnus trades another set of pawns, and now Magnus makes a very interesting decision to trade the queens. Now, in my opinion, if Magnus had eschewed the queen trade and played queen to d6 here, I think there's a very, very good chance that he would have won this game for the following reason. Even though the computer thinks that after rook h1, white is in the game, it still feels very weak here. You have the weak pawn on d5, you have the weak pawn on a3, g3 is also weak. Black can play rook c7, and you just feel like with these open files and these weaknesses in the center of the board, that sooner or later, Abasov is probably going to blunder due to the Magnus effect, if nothing else. But on the other hand, when Magnus trades the queens here, while it's going to be much harder to win the game, the chances of Magnus losing go from minimal to pretty much zero, because in this endgame, the only person who can be better is black after rook c7 here. We get g4, and now we get rook c5. And the reason for that is white has pawn islands. The pawn on d5 still a serious weakness. Pawn on a3 potentially a weakness as well. And the structure on the king side is very balanced. Now, the one issue that black has here is that black cannot get this king to d6. In the endgame, if you're able to blockade a pass pawn with the king in front of the pawn, generally that's one of the best pieces, assuming there aren't knights or bishops that are near your king. If you could blockade this pawn with the king and then activate both of the rooks, black is almost certainly going to win the game. But the problem here is that you can't go king c7, because then you walk into d6 check. If you move the king, you lose the bishop, and with it you lose the game. So Magnus can't quite get the king to d6, and for that reason, white still has some chances to save the game. So in this position, we get a4 instead of king g3, and this is a move that I really don't like, and I think Abasov played it because he figured, well, if rook a5, the bishop can go to b5, bishop can go to b3. Either way, I guard the pawn. But the one drawback to playing a4, and this is something very advanced, is, and probably most people won't think about on first glance, is that you have to look in this endgame at the colors of the bishops. Both sides have light square bishops, but one problem for white is that all of the pawns are on the same color as the black light square bishop. So this bishop here can go after all these pawns, whereas the white bishop cannot go after any of these pawns pretty much. If black goes b6, all the pawns are in the opposite color relative to the white bishop on c4. So here after a4 we get bishop to e8 played by Magnus. Abasov plays bishop b3 guarding the pawn on a4, and Magnus goes rook c3. We get rook to d3, we get the rook swap, and now Magnus goes king c7 trying to bring the king to d6 and blockading the pawn. Now this is a great concept from Magnus, but unfortunately white is just in time here with this move rook to e3, threatening to create the kebab with rook e7. After rook e3 we get bishop g6, and now g5 is played here. Now g5 is a very important move here because, just to illustrate the point, if you get some endgame like this, for example, with g5, computer thinks that maybe this is still a draw after a5, but at any rate you're going to notice that white has 3 pawns on light squares, and this bishop can go after all of these pawns. Now like I said, maybe it's still a draw with perfect play, but the only person who can ever win this game is black, because all the pawns are the opposite color, whereas white's pawns can easily be attacked by the black light square bishop. So here Abasov plays g5, which is very important, because now when Magnus plays rook e8 to trade into the endgame, after you trade these pawns on f6 and trade the rooks, now white is going to be able to get a pawn on a dark square, and in this position, after king d4, king d6, and f4, white only has 2 weaknesses here, the pawns on a4 and d5, and it's also 1 less pawn on the board. In the previous endgame, both sides had 4 pawns. Now with only 3 pawns on the board, it becomes much easier to save the game. Now I was fairly surprised that Abasov did actually trade the rooks on e8. I felt that after takes, rook to c3 and a5 was a little bit easier to play, because if black doesn't play a6, say you go bishop f7, there's a6 here, and if black takes, you have rook c6, and after a move like rook b8, you can simply trade, go rook c6, king e5, bishop c4, and the game should end in a draw very shortly. Additionally, if after a5 black plays a6 stopping this move, you can now play a move like rook c4 with ideas like rook b4 hitting the pawn on b7, or potentially checking the king on b6, or rook to f4 attacking the pawn on f6, and I don't really see a whole lot of danger. But as I mentioned before, I think at this point in the game, Abasov was already kind of zoned out, wasn't happy with anything, and he figured, you know what, let's go into this endgame. If I'm losing in this bishop endgame, so be it, but at least I won't have to spend a lot of time and think, and my decisions will be pretty easy. So after a5, king d4, king d6, f4, we get bishop to h5 here by Magnus, and here Abasov plays this move king e4. Magnus goes bishop g4, trying to stop the king from entering. In this position, Abasov plays bishop c2, and at this point the game is technically drawn. Now the unfortunate part about this endgame for Magnus is not so much that it's a draw or that he can try to press, but the problem is that Abasov actually runs out of moves in this endgame. And what I mean by that is, one of the best qualities of Magnus in endgames or even middle games is that he's very good at getting his opponents to blunder when they have multiple options in terms of moves. Now the reason that I say that is because after we get bishop c2, king c5, and bishop b3, Abasov has no choice but to basically wait with the bishop on these 2 squares between c2 and b3, or potentially c2 and d3. White cannot move any other pieces. If you ever push the pawn, for example, black simply takes. If you push the pawn to f5, now you put all 3 pawns on the light squares, and black is actually completely winning after bishop e2, bishop b3, b5, takes. Let's just say bishop to a2, for example. Black can now go a4, and you have to, if you move the king, at some point black will go a3, king here, and then reroute the bishop around the back to win the pawns on either d5 or f5 potentially. If you go king f3, there's bishop h3, king e4, bishop g2, lose the pawn, GG, why not? So you can't ever push the pawn forward to f5. You can't push either pawn. You also can't move the king, because then you lose the pawn. So white is stuck. You can't push pawns, can't move the king, can't move the pawn on a4, and because of that, for Abasov, even though the position is dangerous, it's very easy to play because he moves the bishop, and it's on Magnus to try and find a winning concept, which Magnus is unable to do. So we get bishop b3, Magnus plays bishop h3, Abasov goes bishop c2, and the big problem for Magnus here is that you can't use the bishop and try to activate it, because after bishop g2, the white king goes to f5, and after you trade these 2 pawns, now with the passed f pawn, it becomes a very easy endgame where white will draw with no difficulty. So for Magnus, the problem is that you can't move the bishop off the diagonal because the king gets in, and white just shuffles with the bishop. So either you can bring the king down or push b5, but you don't have many options. So Magnus plays bishop d7, Abasov goes bishop d1, king c4, bishop e2, king c5, bishop d1 back to guard the pawn. We get b6 here from Magnus, simply trying to put the last pawn on a dark square and wait and see if there's another plan that you can find. We get bishop c2, king c4, bishop d3, king b4, bishop c2 back, guarding the pawn. King c3 played by Magnus. We get bishop d1, king c4, bishop e2, king b4, bishop d1, and now Magnus chooses to play king c3 here, which basically is a semi-bluff. When Magnus goes king c3 here, he's hoping that his opponent will not spot this very unusual tactic which exists here. Magnus is hoping here that his opponent will not play his move d6, because after king c4, suddenly the black king is going backwards and going to capture the pawn on d6. So surely you can't push the pawn forward to d6, and if you can't push the pawn, then actually you're in a lot of trouble, because if you move the bishop away, now you lose the pawn and you lose the game. Obviously there are no squares available on this diagonal, so you can't move the bishop. If you can't move the pawn, well, then the only other piece you can really move is the king. And after king to e3, suddenly after bishop to f5, black is getting very serious winning chances here, because now the king has no entry. And after you play bishop e2, king b4, bishop b5, king c5, let's say you go bishop c6. Now after bishop to c2 here, black is coming very close to being able to win one of these pawns on a4 or d5. Now computer still thinks it's probably a draw after king f3, f5, king e3, bishop e4, and bishop d7. Actually, maybe it's not a draw here, but at any rate, it's very close to losing. So what Magnus does is he's hoping that his opponent is going to see, well, d6, king c4, king c5, and you're in a lot of trouble. So surely Abasov is going to get nervous, crack, and make a blunder. But Abasov, true to form throughout this tournament, stays sharp, and he does not miss the tactic that exists here. He does play d6, because after king c4, there's now this excellent move, bishop to g4, sacrificing the bishop. And if black takes the free bishop, now you have f5, cutting off the bishop on the diagonal, and you're going to lose on the next turn. After king c5, d7, white gets a queen, and white wins the game. So Magnus was hoping that Abasov wouldn't see it, but Abasov does see this idea, and now the game is essentially a draw, because what's going to happen is Magnus makes a check. We get king e3, bishop takes a4, d7. Magnus has to sack the bishop for the pawn, but with these two outside pawns, even though white has an extra bishop, the game is a draw, simply because white will have to bring the king back to stop these two connected pawns, and black will be able to go after the pawn in f4. The game concludes with b5. We get king d2, b4, bishop e6, king d4, f5 played here, trying to lock the pawn on the light square where the bishop always guards it, and black is unable to get rid of this pawn. But unfortunately for Abasov here, even though he has an extra bishop, these two connected pawns are too much. And after a4, we get king c2, king e4, bishop d7, king e5, king d3. You cannot take the pawn, because then black takes your last remaining pawn, and it's a draw. So we get king d3, a3, king c2, a2, king b2, b3, and now you cannot capture this pawn on b3 here, because black gets a queen. In fact, it would be the same thing even all the way back here. If you get this position back here, even king e5 here is still a draw, because in this position it's the exact same problem, where the pawns are guarding each other, and whenever you try to capture this one, I push this one. If you don't take it, I get a queen, and when you capture, I take your last pawn, and it's a draw. So it doesn't matter where the pawns get to, but at the end of the day, the pawns get to b3 and a2, and after bishop e6, we get king e4 here. Abasov decides to capture the pawn on b3. We get queen takes, king f5, bishop c2, king e5, king b1, f5, and after bishop takes f5, the game is drawn, because neither side has mating material. Even without capturing the bishop, this is a draw, because you cannot mate with the lone king and bishop. So with this draw, Magnus Carlsen wins the match against Abasov by a score of 1.5 to half, and he moves on to the final, where he will play either Fabiano Caruana or Ramesh Babu Pragnanantha, as I mentioned at the start of the video. So it's going to be very exciting. Magnus is a couple games away from winning the World Cup for the very first time. He seems to be on form. His opponents have played well, but Magnus on average has been a little bit better. So if Magnus can keep it together for a couple more games, he will win one of the very few events that he has never won in his career. On that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I will be back either tomorrow with a recap of the tiebreaker, or with game number 1 of the finals, where Magnus will be playing on Tuesday. So I hope you guys have enjoyed, and I'll see you soon. Hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Bye.